Okay, can we start? Greetings, everyone. My name is Lance Loskiter, and I'm an HPS scholar and PhD candidate. I'm also an Atlantic Fellow based in South Africa and an emerging voice for global health for the 2020 cohort. A warm welcome to you in joining this gathering, a space and conversation for reflexive and collective imaginative co-building of methods and practices that inform what a socially just health system is or might be. Some of us are part of a collective called African Health Futures, and everyone involved and who will be offering perspectives today are all part of the Atlantic Fellows for Health and Social Equity. Today, we gathered to have a reflexive, warm, and open conversation where we connect viscerally and use applied transformative pedagogy. A principle as part of the transformative pedagogy, we see this organized session as an opportunity for knowledge creation and co-production. And it's useful in the ways that it helps us to read the world in ways that center people's experiences and humanity, which can ultimately inform our processes and our outputs from this generative space. And some of this outputs include further webinars and cross-continental conversation on tools that can be used to decolonize HPSR. And this also feeds into a convening that was supported by the Atlantic Institute and Health Systems Global, the African chapter, to really understand decolonizing HPSR, but also taking forward the collective knowledge and experience to influence the Health Systems Global space and the African Regional Network of HSG, as well as future HPSR symposia, with possibilities of a decolonizing HPSR thematic working group or subcluster. Part of this conversation will also feed into a series of collaborative academic and non-academic outputs, drawing on innovative and transformative tools, methods, and pedagogies, and we welcome you to be part of that process. For more information and to live tweet this session, please visit our website, www.africanhealthfutures.co.za, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at AFRI, that's AFRI, Decol Health, using the hashtags Reimagine Health, Tools for Reimagining, from theory to practice. And we're hoping that Shanazo Kinsey can share those in the chat room or in the forum. Before we start the proceedings, we just need to do some quick housekeeping. And I'm going to ask Cheryl to put up the housekeeping slide. Great. So we have the support chat function where you can access the support on top of the right corner of the page at any time if you face any technical issues. We also have a Q&A at the end of the session. Please send your questions to the live Q&A section next to the screen addressing the speaker by name. And we're hoping to have a really robust conversation. As for the best user experience for the virtual conference, please view the sessions in full screen. Sessions are recorded and will be available to view the next day, so that will be tomorrow, and will remain available for 14 days post-conference. Please adjust your browser zoom ratio to 67% and play the session in full screen. I'm just hearing some feedback. By selecting the enlarge icon on the top right corner of the session window. I will now hand over to Sibusiso Filane, who is a young South African artist and activist working as an intern at the Rural Health Advocacy Project, an organization that advocates for health systems in rural communities to access equitable quality healthcare services here in South Africa. He has recently completed his master's in drama therapy, and as an applied theater practitioner, he facilitates processes to help people process emotions and feelings through contemplative reflective practice and reporting on individual well-being and collective well-being. This young leader is a recipient of multiple awards for his work. Sibusiso seeks to use interactive radio to help rural and marginalized communities form part of public health dialogues. And through research, he's also contributing quite radically to the development of South African drama therapy. Sibusiso, I welcome you to warm up this space for us, to bring awareness to our bodies in this space, connecting our bodies to our minds, to enable and ground or tap into our imaginings as living and present in the space. Sibusiso, over to you. Sibusiso, over to you. I think we have a challenge to connect Sibusiso.
I think we do. So Lance, perhaps we could run through the activity with you and I, and when Sibusiso jumps on, he can come right in. How's that?
Yes, I think Sibusiso just received the prompt. And I think
okay,
the
great.
video just started. Yeah, great. Sibusiso, are you with us? I see that you, great, fantastic.
Yes, can you hear me? Hi.
Yes.
So you can start the process.
Okay, thank you, Lance. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to our fellow participants. I'll take you, everyone else, through an interactive process. So I would invite you to be interactive. So I'll ask one part of this process to take.
Lance, are we struggling to get Sibusiso on? I think we're having some challenges with the connection.
I think we are.
Okay,
can
so
you see me now?
Yeah, Sibusiso, I think we're having challenges with your connection. So what I am going to ask, because it just keeps blurring out, is just to stop your video for now, because Lance is a little bit clearer, and just to have Lance run us through the activity. Is that okay, Lance?
That's okay.
Okay, let's go ahead.
Alrighty. So what I would like us to do, and this is what Sibusiso was going to ask us to do, I'm just starting my video, is for all of us just to kind of think about our bodies and really think about how do we understand our bodies in relation to our minds. And so the first part of knowing our bodies is a series of exercises that I welcome us to do to get into this imaginative space. And so I would like us to think about, to first start the process with an image, a theater process, a practical exercise. And so I invite you to think about what the current existing health system looks like and what expression in your body would you use when you think about it. So an expression. So for me, it's like this expression that comes on, if you can see my video. And yeah. So that's the expression that I want you to hold. And I just want you to release that expression with our bodies and just warm our bodies again up to again go back into that expression when we think about this current health system. How does our body respond when we think about the current health system? Okay. And so if we can just like move our faces and our hands and our bodies to just kind of release that expression again And now I want you to imagine what a health system that you would dream or imagine to be, and make that expression. When you think about a reimagined health system, how would your body respond? And so when you think about that reimagined process and the response to your body, I want you to go back to the practice of the current health system and move into your imagined state. So the current health system and the imagined state. And the current health system and the imagined state, an imagined health system. And we really hope that you can feel and sense the transition between these two different movements and expressions of the body. And really help us to understand and think through some of the ways in which our mind really helps us to shape our body, but also how our body's experiences and expressions shapes the way we think about the world and think about an imagined health system space. And so what we really want us to think about and reflect on is how our bodies help us learn, understand, and make sense of the world, and how it can influence and even change our minds, and that our bodies have a surprising amount of power in shaping our minds. And we just have to learn how to use it. And so I'm going to invite some reflections on that. Kenza, I can see your video. Do you want to set us off on to how you experience that kind of movement?
Thanks, Lance. I think for me, what is really exciting about an activity like this is that it really grounds you in your body and allows you to rethink how you can communicate with your body, how you're feeling about something. So I had both of my fists up when we were thinking about what does the current health system look like, because for so many people, you have to fight for basic access, basic services. But then when I moved my body into sort of like the reimagined space, it was so easy. It was like there was a weight lifted off of my shoulders. And I would want every person to, when they're thinking about the health system in their country, in their community, they would have to think about this, but instead they can think about this.
Okay, thanks. Is there anyone else, one of the participants, to reflect on that process, if people were able to engage and get involved?
I see Shanaz has posted a comment. Maybe Shanaz, you can share and reflect with us as well. Oh, your mic is off. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, I
think
talk
just
now.
Yeah.
So for me, what I found amazing is the transition. In the transition in my body, I could almost imagine that the possibilities of a health system that is caring, that is holding, that is supportive, that is responsive, actually could be possible, because I can do it with my body. And if I can do it with my body, I know that it is humanly possible. And therefore it reminds me that the systems that's like this is almost intentional and designed this way, but that this movement up is where we need to go. And for me, it looks like this, you know, and for Lance, it looked like this, but I could imagine both possibilities and I wanted to be there. So that was really quite exciting for me. And it's weird because it's different hearing it, but to do the movement, it gives me that energy and excitement. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shanaz. And I tried to do justice to Sibusito's warming up of the space, but that was really a process to connect our bodies and our thoughts and our feelings and warm up the space to make us aware of how our bodies shift and change as we nurture deeper consciousness and imaginative praxis. So this session will now commence with a moderated panel discussion that will follow a short Q&A where we will invite participants to share and reflect on ideas, strategies, approaches, methods, and tools for reimagining. And I hope that this segment where we try to kind of facilitate a praxis of imagination through our bodies reflects our intentionality of applying transformative pedagogy and facilitating a space for social change, although we are limited by the virtual reality of space. I have now the honor of introducing Kense Khadebe, who will be moderating the panel discussion in Q&A. And Kense is the project manager for the Bertha Center for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and she's the co-founder of the Counseling Hub. Kense's work explores how institutions and organizations advance equity and social justice. Over to you, Kense.
Thanks, Lance. Thanks for that brilliant introduction. So let's dive straight into the conversation, because we actually don't have a lot of time to delve into a lot of the elements and concepts that we want to unpack. But as Lance mentioned previously in the framing during the introduction, is that a large part of this conversation that we're wanting to have today is really a culmination of smaller conversations that we've been having in the build-up to the HSG Africa convening, as well as other conversations that we've been having amongst each other as panel members. So what we really wanted to do today was really bring together a group of doers who we greatly admire in terms of the work that they do, and to talk to them about their methodologies and forms of practice that inform their work. And importantly for us, we wanted to really dig into what are the lessons that they have to share for those of us who are working within the health systems, either as researchers, activists, or practitioners. So if you have any questions, we are going to address all of those in the Q&A. But for now, I'd like to introduce our four panelists. I'd like to start with Evie O'Brien from New Zealand. Evie is the interim director of the Atlantic Institute, where she supports the development of over 500 fellows globally. Evie's background is in educational leadership, where her teaching and research are focused on Indigenous, Maori, and social change leadership, leading in complex organizations and high-performance teams. We're also joined by Sompom Pengam from Thailand. Sompom is the founder and director of the Community Health Impact Assessment Platform in Southeast Asia. Sompom's work has seen her working with governments and health institutions in Thailand, Myanmar, and the Philippines. In 2019, Sompom was awarded the Atlantic Senior Fellows Award for her work on the development of the Community-Centered Health Impact Assessment Program in the Philippines. We're also joined by Koch Vorakon, also from Thailand. Koch is a landscape architect who works on building green public spaces that tackle climate change. Koch is the founder and CEO of the Porous Cities Network, a landscape architecture social enterprise working to increase urban resilience in Bangkok. Koch has been recognized globally for her bold and innovative projects, including being listed as one of the Time Magazine's 2019 Next Generation Leaders. And then lastly, we're joined by Shanaz Munshi. Shanaz is an HPSR researcher, an occupational therapist, and an emerging voice fellow. Her research focuses on strengthening health systems to provide quality care with a concern for understanding the intersections between race, gender, and health equity in post-colonial contexts. Shanaz is based at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and she also serves on the steering committee of the People's Health Movement. So as you can see, we were really quite intentional about curating a space where we could draw from the knowledges and experiences from those who work in fields that intersect with health systems in some way. And where we really wanted to start the conversation today was maybe to start with you, Evie, and particularly why is because your work is really foregrounded in ideas around identity, collective language, culture. And we wanted to know from you, what are some of the concepts and the methodologies that you have found in your work that have been valuable and useful when you're doing work that engages directly with social justice? And if you have any examples to share with us from your work, that would be particularly relevant.
Sure, thanks, Kense. Hello, everyone. And it's my honour and privilege to be alongside these extraordinary fellows in conversation. So I guess very briefly, my background is in education rather than in health, but I guess that's fundamentally the problem, is that we silo these ideas or these concepts or systems when really they are part of a holistic system. And I think in New Zealand, as an Indigenous woman, the anchor for Indigenous peoples is our identity, our language and our culture, and our beliefs and our histories and her stories. And it's that informs the reclamation or the dismantling, for want of a better word, of education systems, of health systems. So a system, building a new system where, in my case, Indigenous knowledges are privileged and are legitimised, rather than them being viewed as the other. And that's not to reject Western knowledge and systems, but rather to anchor what we do as teachers, as activists, in who we are. So I guess by way of a brief example, and again, it's a New Zealand example, even though I live in Oxford in the UK and work with these incredible fellows, is the establishment of wānanga, which are sovereign universities in New Zealand, established to amplify, to lift up Māori or Indigenous knowledge systems as an alternative system. Rather than dismantling or decolonising an existing system, it's replacing it with a new one. And that's and what that does is shifts from pathology, from figuring out what's wrong and diagnosing what's wrong with an existing system, to potential and hope and to reimagining. So yeah, I hope that made sense.
No, that absolutely does. Thank you. And thank you for highlighting these ideas around reclamation and alternative knowledges, because I think that's a big part of the conversation that we're trying to have today. And I think that brings in, Sompom, a lot of the work that you do. You've worked a lot with governments and NGOs, and you founded an organization that advocates for community level health impact assessments. So you're centering community knowledge and community understanding. And what I wanted to ask you maybe is to reflect on the tools that you've used in the work where you're centering communities and their voices. How does power play into that? Oh, I think you're muted, Sompom. If you can unmute yourself. There we go.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kenzie, and hi, everyone. My work is about health impact assessment, or HIA. The health impact assessment is a decision support tool for building healthy public policy and health equity. And it seeks to predict the future consequence for health of possible decision and aim to inform decision making. And HIA typology in which different purpose, different form consists of mandate, health impact assessment, decision support, health impact assessment, and advocacy, HIA, and the last one is about the community-led health impact assessment. I think most health practitioners are familiar with the mandate HIA, that HIA integrated with environmental impact assessment to support decision making in development project license approval. For example, dam, mining, coal-fired power plant, etc. But in my country, in Thailand, the environmental health impact assessment system is an unfair system because it allows the project owner rather than local people. The people who affect cannot participate in the environmental health impact assessment process meaningfully. It also has a politics of knowledge that the methodologies might focus on the expert disciplinary knowledge, not recognize the lay expertise. So I try to close this gap by balancing the power in the impact assessment system. So I am interested in developing the Community Health Impact Assessment, or CHIA. That is empowering the community to have a capacity to do impact assessment, engage in decision making, and negotiate with the policymaker. The core concept is cooperation of knowledge among lay knowledge and expert knowledge. I mean, when we do community health impact assessment, it's not mean the community they stand alone, but we need to co-production and work together among the lay people and the expert. And the CHAA is also emphasized community core value and community life as well. And the CHA not only used to cope with the mandate and but it has also applied to other public policy that affect health also. As in the case of the Karen community, Karen is the indigenous people in Thailand. They live in the border of Thai and Myanmar. And right now they have been affected by COVID-19 control measure. And the forest policy forced them to move out of the original land. It is not possible to farm in the traditional way. So when the COVID-19 outbreak occurred, the villagers, they're facing about the food security problem. So the community, they conduct CHAA to provide evidence of how past policy have caused health injustice and make a solution on how work together to solve problem. And in conclusion, I would like to say that the CHA is a tool that help community, especially the marginalized group, get unfairness from project and public policy, making their voice louder, and know to make a decision in the public policy process. And the last one is very important, dare to speak the truth to the power that oppresses them.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Sompom. I think what's really interesting about what you're saying is how it ties in around what Evie was speaking around alternative knowledges, and then you were also talking about the politics of knowledge. But I also think what you were speaking about the role between the environment and the impact of climate change on health ties in quite nicely with the work that Koch does. So Koch, you've spoken previously about how you found your calling in doing work that directly deals with the impact of climate change in urban areas. One of the projects that you worked on, which was actually recently awarded the 2020 United Nations Global Climate Action Awards, an urban park that was designed in Bangkok utilizing amphibious design principles. So for those of you who don't know, I also went and looked up what those were, but actually amphibious design principles is the idea that instead of obstructing natural flooding cycles, the design focuses on how you can leverage off the flooding cycles that already exist. So often when we're talking about reimagining, we're often talking about creating something new. But what I liked about this concept of amphibious design principles is that it leans into the idea of, let me work with what I have. So Koch, what I'd like you to reflect, speak about how creativity and reimagining, weaves into your work and the work that you and your organization do.
I think creativity is very important, but it's actually the critical point is working on what you have. Because if it's too much creativity, but in the reality and in the practical, because I'm an architect, landscape architect. So in reality, if it's not working, it's actually just creativities. But when you put it into form and you collaborate with people, environment, all the challenges that you have, and try to answer more than just one particular solution, but actually into wellness, to climate change, quality of life, and biodiversity of the city. So I just feel that the integration of creativity is so important that is beyond just oneself. It's actually you're thinking instead of the community, instead of the bee, the pollinators, and many more. So I just feel that the emerge of creativities and reality is where is so important. Yes.
Thanks. I like how you speak about the immersion of both creativity and reality. And I want to bring you, Shanaz, in a little bit, because we've spoken a lot about this. And ironically, you're the only HPSR traditional scholar in this panel, but you work in South Africa and you're committed to the Liberation and Transformation Project. But what that means is that there's often this commitment to praxis that is deeply transformative. what do you propose to HPSR scholars, activists, advocates and practitioners who are grappling with institutional concerns that center on dismantling power relations, thinking about what Evie, Sompom, and Koch have just said? How can these practices be translated into something that's meaningful for those of us who work in the health system space?
Thank you so much, Kenzie, for this challenging question. And I'd just like to say that we asked this question on day 3 of the HSG Africa convening, after speaking for 2 days, contextualizing and considering the theory. And this was a really an ongoing conversation we're having. So the first place HPSR scholars need to start on everyday practices of conscientization and awareness along the 4 terrains of power: knowledge, being, and doing. These are the 4 terrains. Now, Sibusiso, via Lance, he gave us a small virtual taster of the visceral experience that shows us the potential of what is possible if we are willing, as people of color, as Black people, as queer Africans, as with our curly hair, our limited English, our challenges with internet, if we are willing to see ourselves as valuable in spaces that were not built for us. If we are able to see that we are worthy as knowledge holders, experts of our realities, and as leaders for a more socially just world. If we see ourselves as knowledge creators in universities as central to the creation of systems of health or health systems that are responsive to people who look like us, and as people that recognize the humanity and the agency of those who are systemically disenfranchised. And here I echo some of the sentiments Evie brought out, and reclamation and acknowledgement. This conscientization project requires us to reckon with ourselves as HPSR scholars, to take a radical political stance based on the values that we commit to. That is, of not tolerating oppressive power over anyone's humanity, not tolerating the commodification of our health, not accepting the oppressive power makes the decision of who gets to live, who gets to die, who has land, who is the landless. The problem with oppressive power is that it has been normalized in our everyday life. And in our Africa convening, Pascal Olati asked us, how brave are we in the quest for disruption of coloniality? So what does disruption look like? How do we hold systems accountable? How do we effect change? The Africa Health Future Project is a liberatory project, a reclamation project, one that is committed to an iterative process of reflection on one's bravery and biases, both implicit biases and explicit biases, and then to consciously try again with compassion, with empathy, with deep listening, because the cost of not doing so is large. So we are fighting this feeling of being an imposter, an alien, that comes with alienation that comes with being racialized, gendered, othered, and an alterity upon which the colonial project endures and reimagines itself. So the question of how countries affected by various versions of structural adjustments programs that have led to the collapse of health systems, how can we stand up to philanthrocapitalism and donor aid that strengthens vertical programs, top-down decision-making structures, data systems that perpetuate colonial narratives and classification, the sidelining of sexual reproductive health and rights in the response to COVID-19, the intellectual property rights over vaccine, fracking of indigenous lands are some of the areas where coloniality endures within our health system. So ultimately, disruption looks like, how do we determine what social justice looks like for ourselves? Thank you, Kenzie.
Thanks, Shanaz. I mean, you highlighted so many different points and it was so meaty. There's so much to unpack. But I liked what you were speaking about in terms of beliefs and values. And this is where I want to bring Evie in a little bit, because often when we're talking about addressing health systems and the inequalities within our health systems, it's quite easy to talk to issues like finance and funding and human resources. But sometimes it gets a little bit hard to talk about issues like values, beliefs, norms, these intangible elements that underpin our health systems. So Evie, in your work, when you speak about embracing principles, values, and practices that dismantle contemporary forms of power, Why do you think it's so challenging sometimes to grapple with some of these abstract concepts? Even if we do have a firm grasp on it, sometimes it's really hard to talk about. What has been some of your experiences around that?
Well, I think, and again, I can only talk about the New Zealand experience. I think part of, obviously, the agenda in terms of the colonising project for New Zealand was to assimilate the Indigenous people, of the original people of the land, into the culture, language, beliefs of the settlers who were coming into the land. And so what that meant, what that resulted in, was a loss of language and culture and land, and the movement of Māori people from their communities, from their rural communities to urban areas in the 50s and 60s was the greatest move of any group of people per capita, in the world. So it was this huge move of people away from their communities. So I think that was part of the agenda, and I would suspect, without actually wanting to speak for other Indigenous groups around the world, that would be the case elsewhere. So part of the reclamation is a reclamation of that language and culture and identity and values, and lifting it up within ourselves and leaning in with open arms to others. So the example I gave before, actually, I'll give you another example. With COVID-19, the New Zealand government, who have done really well in terms of the management, the leadership of cases in New Zealand, when they announced lockdown, they had a whole lot of, it was a systemic lockdown across New Zealand. What Māori did was take a sovereign action, and so did their own thing in terms of keeping Māori communities or Indigenous communities healthy and safe, taking into account issues of equity. So people over the age of 70, I think it was, were categorised as being at risk in terms of being elderly, and they were at risk and they were to be protected. Māori made the decision that age point would be 60, because Indigenous peoples in New Zealand are sicker, dying before others. And so all of the resources would be poured into people over the age of 60. That's one example. And that's very much coming from a place of care for people, and from a place, an obligation that we are accountable and responsible to each other, so we're not alone. And so it's not about our individual wellness and flourishing, it's about the wellness and flourishing of the community. And so that was a sovereign action that was taken. So yeah, so I think as I said before, part of it is a reclamation within groups, whichever the groups are, of language, culture and identity, as the lens through which we engage in the world, and through which we understand power and the rebuild of new systems.
Thank you so much, Evie. I liked how you were speaking about the reclamation within groups. And I think before we move into our Q&A, which we'll move into in a few short minutes, I wanted to ask Koch a question around that, because you were saying your work actually intersects directly with how women are impacted by environmental change as well as environmental racism. How do you see that coming through in your work?
Well, as we all know that the most impacted,
oh, there we go.
Can you, yes, as we all know that the most vulnerable and the most, those who are affected from climate change are women and children. And I think that to really encourage this group of people to be part of the decision making is so crucial, because we actually working for them as well. It's not only working for those who have budget, those who have money, and those who have like high technology to solve the environmental problems. So in my work, I just try to leverage that different. And I just feel that, and myself as a woman, I'm also affected as a nation, as a region, the most coastline region in the world that facing sea level rise as well. So I just feel that if we don't have a just society or just world, we cannot fix climate change problem.
Thanks, Koch. So we're starting to see some of the questions come through the Q&A section. So what I will do now, and this is for the panelists, I will share a question with you, and whoever feels like they'd like to answer it, or I'll direct it if it's being directed to a particular panel member. And for the audience, please continue sharing more of your questions, and we'll try to get as many of them answered by our panelists. But our first question for the day is from Christoph de Costa. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And Christoph asks, to what extent is it trying to find your deeper consciousness combinable with the typical academic, publish or perish, whilst also juggling all the admin and personal commitments that you have? And I'm going to direct this question to Shanaz, because you're currently based at an academic institution. What is your experience of this?
Kenzie, can you repeat the first part of the question? I'm still processing.
Sure. So the first part of the question is, to what extent is this trying to find your deeper consciousness combinable with the typical academic, publish or perish environment, where you're also juggling all the admin and personal commitments? So it's like, how do we create this change when we've got the reality of being at an academic and higher academic institution?
So thank you, Christoph, for that question. I don't know that there's any easy answer. I think that in my experience, my experience is also contextualized, right? So living in South Africa, we experience as a country many significant moments of change. And one of the moments that really put universities at a halt was the Rhodes Must Fall movement, which was an intentional decolonial moment in South Africa. And within this moment, students literally stopped the university from functioning in order for the structures of power to observe them, to see them, to hear them, to understand that this idea that students, Black students, women students that come from rural areas, the structural violence in the university space is not going to be, it's not welcoming, it's not supportive of education, and it's affecting both their spiritual, their mental, their physical health. And so within that moment, I think that we situate our project as well as 3 South Africans, where the universities were forced then to try to create spaces to have some of these conversations. And so summer schools were created on decoloniality, which is one I attended one, and these opportunities. The other thing is creating spaces with people to think, like-minded people to think, which is why we created, with the support of the Atlantic Institute, the Africa Health Convening as a deliberate space to begin this process of stopping, thinking, breathing, listening to ourselves, and to try to disrupt the systems of oppressive power. So they still exist, and we need to collectively determine the way forward. And I think we've only begun that process. And I wonder if maybe Lance or Kenzie has something more to add to that. But that's as far as I can say right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Shanaz. And I think what you're saying and the experiences that you're sharing actually make me want to link to Sompom and the work that you do. You spoke earlier about, working with policymakers, but also working with like mining institutions, and I'm curious about, how do you navigate the challenges in terms of the system and the balance with community mobilization and the environment that you work in? So like the limitations imposed by bureaucracy and policymakers and the outside world, how does that impact the kind of community mobilization that you're trying to do?
Thank you for the question. For me, I think it's the challenge is about how the community, they have the courage to deal with the policymaker. I think the capacity building is very important, because in the system right now, it's allow only the policymaker and the project owner or I think, or technocrat academia to join the system and make decision together, but ignore the local people. And because the academia or the local people have no knowledge. So, okay, you just wait the academia or the politician make decision for them. But for me, I think it's very important and challenge how we empower them to collect and to collect the data and can engage in the policy decision making. I think it's very important and it's very the challenge because the system right now is not allow them to engage. It's not only about the knowledge, but it's about the politics as well. Then as I mentioned about the politics of knowledge. When about the impact assessment, it's not only about the research, but in the process, it's not a many politics in each step. Because the researcher may be pick up some issue that they believe about the scientific method and maybe ignore the concern of the people and maybe about the wisdom or the lay knowledge about this. I think it's a very challenging how we can combine the lay knowledge and the expert together and make decision together, and how to convince the policymaker recognize the lay people together. I think it's very challenging.
Thanks. I see you raising your fist there, Coach. So I almost want to bring you in as well, because I would imagine that in, working in climate change and thinking about climate change and policymaking in the world today, there are a lot of people who are on the other side trying to work against some of the more progressive changes that we need to make. What have been some of your experiences?
Me, myself? Yes. I'm actually just went to one of APEC. APEC is like Asian Pacific Economics Council or something. And then I try to raise the issue that with the pandemic, right now we should talk about climate change because the development or the business cannot grow. Like we cannot just addict to growth by neglecting what we have as a resource. And all this meeting, these like high ranking leaders came for the meeting. They can't talk about climate change because they only want to talk about free trade, or they want to only talk about how we're gonna get GDP higher than last year. This is so sad. And I just like, no, be in reality that we cannot just like talking the same vocabulary, thinking the way economics work. And right now, as we can see that globalizations and free trade actually have some failure. And we have to admit that so we can move further. And everyone seems to agree, but when it's come to politics, and we have to wait for other politics as well, because all this meeting, they invite US presidents. And of course, this is last week. So we just like, let's hope that Trump, I'm sorry, Trump is not coming back, because if Trump coming back, we cannot have climate change word in any paper, in any like invitation. And I just like, this is so sad. And I just like, oh, we fought so hard on the ground and even top down, but in the world level, we still like bottom up, right? And if that person, the leader of the world, whoever we put those person there, they're not convinced on reality that we are working for, the equity, I just feel that we have to work harder. Yes.
Thanks, Coach. Thanks for bringing that concept of leadership, because I think in all the HSG sessions that we've had since the beginning of this conference, leadership has come up as a theme in a number of sessions, whether we're talking about, human resources, we're talking about corruption, politics. And Evie, I want to bring you in a little bit, because your background has been in leadership and complex organizations, but also in your current role, you're working with leaders, across the world who are doing very exciting things. And I'm wondering, when you're sitting in your role thinking about how do we create transformative leaders who can commit to, changing systems, what are some of the things that are sitting in, your mind as top of mind in terms of methodologies and practices that we should be embedded in?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think in the particular example of the Atlantic Fellows community, and as was introduced at the beginning, it's a community of change makers across the world, all united in their pursuit for equity globally. Each of those senior fellows, so they're Atlantic senior fellows, are extraordinary leaders in their own right, and doing incredible work across racial equity, health equity, social equity, economic equity. I think one of the biggest opportunities or potential to be released, if you like, is to create the spaces and places and architecture for leaders like that to connect and to collaborate together in a meaningful way, in an intentional way. And for these leaders to lift their heads above their ecosystems, as Kumi Naidu described last year. That often when we're engaged in critical work in whether it's in health or whatever field that we're in, education, that more often than not, our conversations and our learning and our debate occurs in an ecosystem, or in an echo chamber, And so I think one of the challenges for leaders, or the opportunities for leaders, is to really lift themselves out of that echo chamber and to have conversations with people who under normal circumstances they would never have a conversation with. Where there is diversity in terms of background and experience and origin and language and culture, but what connects are a set of values and a united pursuit for equity and together. And so what I've observed with these leaders is a new type of imagining around what could happen around narrative change, around shifting policy and learning from each other. I think this panel is a perfect example. Under normal circumstances, I don't think Koch, Sompon, Shanaz, Kensei, Lance would have ever imagined that this group would have come together and would be in conversation together. And to think about the transformative learning that occurs as a result, because often we have to leave our ego behind, lean in, and really listen and learn from each other and think about different solutions. Would that apply in my context? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and as I said, opportunities for leaders today. And yet, there's been this retreat globally to nationalism rather than breaking down walls. And so, I do think that there's a wonderful opportunity for that in terms of reimagining what new health systems look like. It's not limiting your conversations to those in your particular country, but exactly what this conference is doing is having conversations with others where there might be discomfort, but again, there's learning and finding new solutions. And I use that word carefully, new solutions, i.e. the K is in brackets before the NEW. We already know what the solutions are. It's a matter of having the conditions and the architecture and the resources and the space and the belief in ourselves to bring those forward.
Thanks for that reflection. And I want to almost take the one word you were speaking around discomfort, and I want to bring you, Shanaz, into the conversation, because your career has been dedicated to working in the health system space. And I'm wondering, having listened to sort of what we're speaking about, what do you think are some of the challenges that prevent those of us who are working directly in the health systems from engaging in this kind of work where we're leaning in and listening outside of just the space where we work? And the reason I ask this is because, my background is in mental health. and I work in Cape Town in South Africa. And I recognize that one of the biggest challenges for us in the mental health space, especially working for an NGO, is that we work in silos. We're caught in like this funding cycle where we just focus on what's happening in our own system. Meanwhile, there's so many of these other bigger picture elements and these other pieces that are moving that are having a direct impact on our own system, but a lack of collaboration and not creating an inclusive and generative space allows us then to just stay in our own corner. And I'm wondering, what are some of your reflections then, Shanaz, around, for those who are listening as health systems practitioners, what do we take out of a conversation like this, really?
Thank you, Kente. I mean, another difficult question around this discomfort and how do we find these solutions? I think you know, a lot of what Sampan described in her work is that the structures of power make it really difficult for those on the margins to have a voice, to have an opening, to have a space. And it links back to Christoph's point, where as a researcher, my incentives in furthering my career are limited to how many publications I have produced, how many, do I have a PhD? Do I have a good position in a job? How many tweets have I put out? Where do I position myself? Which ultimately is such a full-time job in and of itself. It distracts me from really the kind of work that Sampam has been able to achieve in her work, which is really taking the time, taking the effort, taking the energy to enter into a community and recognize that it's not what Sampam wants, but really the voices of the community that need to guide her action. It's similar to what Lance is doing, also working in their PhD work around stepping into a health system as a queer body and asking the question, how is the health system responsive to someone who looks like me? And to be able to theorize from a position of a researcher, but also someone who has a lived experience. And in my work, as I am an occupational therapist who positioned myself in community, working as a community worker, to moving to a health systems space where I'm working in researching and implementation challenges of community health workers. For me, the challenge is, how do I really create, how do I sit with my own discomfort around my own career advancement to really centering my work into creating spaces for the community health workers who are leaders, who are women, who really understand what the challenges are to bring their voices into the space. And ultimately, you know, there's 75 community health workers in South Africa who need to be integrated and embedded in the communities they serve. And they are speaking to this question of needing to be legitimized, to be acknowledged, and through structures that, like career path, effective training, supervision, decent work for decent pay according to the International Labour Organization, and yet they are given a small stipend. So these women are who carry the burden of the country's dysfunctional systems, where as mostly Black women, their bodies can be seen as sites of violence. They are the ones that I think are front and center to the struggle for really empowering the essential elements of comprehensive primary health care and universal health coverage. So for me, it really is, how do I enable these women really to lead us in the policy solutions? How do we create spaces for them to bring them into conversations, into health systems, global convenings, into policy spaces, and into other spaces that they can contribute meaningfully? And I think it's about having patience, because if we start that shift now, and we allow, as Sampam is doing, community health workers, marginal communities, as we are trying to do in South Africa, to be these co-producers of knowledge, to be embedded in the decision-making, to advise us as to which technologies they want to do towards social justice, I think that with that openness in mind, we can effect change. But it really requires a collective decision that we're actually going to take a stance, that it's no longer we're going to allow the normalized status quo that is totally unequal and oppressive to exist, and that we'd like to position ourselves as social justice workers. And we're brave to take that radical stance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that deep reflection, Shanaz. We have another question that has come through here in the Q&A, and I want to bring you in, Koch, maybe to take a first stab at it. It's from Lucy Gilson, and she asks us, what would you suggest Health Systems Global does differently or more of in the future to deepen networks? And I suppose I'm not asking you this as, somebody who's in, health systems, but I'd rather want to flip the question a little bit and say, in your professional, experiences, what has worked in terms of facilitating collaboration and creating spaces for people to work with each other as opposed to across each other?
I just feel that what I'm kind of fighting for is public space. And I just feel that this is a very basic equity that you can just read by walking into cities. Like if you walk into more just society, it's talking about universal design just on the street, that really thinking about handicaps, aging society, kids and women equally, and even access to the park, which is such an urban dense context. We don't have place to breathe, like even just to exercise. And I just feel that this should become something that really normal as a health system as well. So I'm not talking about something policy and the service, but I'm actually talking about the quality of life, the public health that every citizen should have. And to work on that is actually, and we can see the suffering when we live in the city, like how we walk and we tips, and how the handicapped cannot use the city at all, or even when you break your leg, you cannot just walk. So I just feel that this basic need have to be met, and something sophisticated when you're sick is another thing. But I'm talking about everyday life, because my profession and my skill is offering about the environmental, and that's also a part of the health. So I just feel that to integrate many people, government sector, mayors, the community that will impact normal people that use the city every day. So how can we create the conversation that have an outcome, that have a solution within the budget, within the timing? So I just feel that working in that realm is not different than health system. Yes.
So I think if I'm hearing you, what you're saying, Koch, correctly, is actually organizing across the board. So maybe perhaps the lesson for HSG would be to say, who else should be sitting in this conversation who might not necessarily be working in health systems? So I think one of the things that I saw, Shanaz, I think you tweeted this out earlier this week around access to Health Systems Global as a conference and who's able to engage in these sessions. And I saw some of the comments and the threads that were coming through, people saying, I do want to participate, but the cost is prohibitive or whatever it may be. So I think maybe to get back to Lucy's question and to almost tie it off is to say, how do we bring more people into the space? And what Koch is saying is collaborate with other people who have a vested interest in the outcomes that I think you're looking for. So I think that's quite important. And I think that also ties in quite nicely, Sompom, with the work that you do around community-centered health impact assessment. And I think for me, the question that I have for you is, having reflected on what Sompom was saying around working with different people, what have you found to work for you in your space? What are some of the tools that have been really practical and valuable?
Is it me or Sompom?
Sompom, sorry. Go ahead, Sompom.
Okay, sorry, can you repeat your question, please?
Sure. I was linking what Koch was saying around bringing together different people to build, effective networks to create social change. So I was thinking around your work, specifically working at the community level. How is that different, and what kind of people do you then have to bring together to create social change?
Okay, thank you. For me, I think when we working with the community, it's not mean only community, but it starts from community needs. But we should start from the community and to decide the process and allow them to review themselves and make a proposal what they need. And after that, we need to collaborate with many people, many agencies can work with the community. So to achieve the quality of their life. So I think it's we need a platform or space to work together. Okay, some issue, okay, it's easy to work together, but some issue that maybe some group that gain, some group loss of the benefit, we need to negotiate and make decision together. So I think it's very important. But the challenge is how to create the platform that equally among the stakeholder that can raise their voice, their needs, and make decision together. And for my role, I design the process that building capacity of the community. And when they're ready to negotiate with the policymaker, I can connect them to policymaker. And if they need academia to help them, maybe some information that difficult, not easy to understand. Okay, I connect them to academia. And when everyone ready, I create a platform and connect every stakeholder together and okay, make a dialogue and make the decision together.
Thanks, Sompom. I like the fact that you brought up the role of the academy and how inaccessible it can be. And I think that's something that we've often spoken about a lot in terms of the language that is utilized in the academy sometimes in and of itself is prohibitive, not even getting into like the structural challenges of accessing higher education and being embedded in that. So I'd like some of your reflections, Evie. I see you nodding and you've worked in the higher education space. What are some of your reflections on what Koch is saying around the academy being difficult to access and understand and some of the challenges around language?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to just pick up on what Sompom was saying and also around the issue of language. And I think, it's, you know, part of our work is flipping the switch on the language we use. And so, for example, when we think about deepening networks, the question that was asked, and thinking about this construct of a network, which is, you know, a web of interconnected relationships that tends to be an ecosystem. And networks have existed for a long time and yet haven't made a dent in terms of health, race, social inequities across the world. I think flipping the switch to using, you know, different language like community, where it's an ecosystem where the aim is to build a sense of belonging and a sense of common purpose. I think that's really important. So now what was your next question? Sorry, Kensei, around the academy?
No, that's perfect. It was just reflecting on the role of language. So I think you've captured some of those elements, Evie.
Yeah, cool.
Shanaz, and this is for the whole panel as well. We have about 5 minutes left, but I know this is also a topic that you like to speak into quite a lot around the role of language and access. I'm going to give you about 2 minutes maybe to reflect on that, and then we'll bring the panel to a close and then move off to Lance. Shanaz, go ahead.
So I think that one of the instrumentalization of colonialism was that it relied on alterity, the state of otherness that creates opposites in a way it subverses identity. So you have black or white, you have men versus women, you have, you know, the normative versus indigenous community. It's a way of dehumanizing and determining who has access to resources and who should not, who should be the workers and who should be the recipients. So language is really critical to this process of categorization, and it features in our policies, our processes, and our structures. So even the language of healthcare, it's actually alienating to the ordinary people. So when thinking about the question of even access, it's not just in health system, it's also about accessing to understanding different understandings of the body. So Maori people will understand the body differently. Indigenous South African people, people in India, people in Thailand, you know, the indigenous land defenders in the US, different understandings of bodies that differ maybe from the westernized logic, and many of us are already westernized, so we've shifted away from what is indigenous. So these inform meaning making and inform epistemic traditions of ways of meaning making, ways of being, ways of doing, and ways of healing. So these narratives, they you know, they're quite sophisticated, and they feature within systems and also in the media. So around, and COVID-19 was a really interesting example, because there was a narrative that Africans would be dying of the streets of COVID-19, which perpetuates this alterity and doesn't acknowledge the sophisticated knowledge of the localized decision-making strategies that were employed by communities during lockdown, like what Evie described as the Maori community made sovereign decisions. So did communities in and across the African continent. So again, this narrative, it serves the commodification of health systems over access to publicly funded health system. And this determines the endurance of coloniality today. So our project is an imaginative project. So we need to undo, we need to think, we need to question our language. We need to question the words we use. Is it a health system, or is it systems of health? Is it, you know, all the, are we keep talking about leaving no one behind? Who's doing the leaving? Who's being left behind? Who do we mean when we talk about communities or marginalized? How do we regurgitate? Is it about, you know, regurgitating frameworks to come up with solutions, or to really go back to developing new ones that are rooted in the material conditions of people? So yes, language is important, and yes, I can go on for it. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Shanaz. I think that's a perfect end to the session. And I'll hand over to Lance just to close for us in under 40 seconds. Lance.
Thank you so much. I can't seem to put on my video, but just, there, I can start it now. But just to express gratitude to our amazing panelists for making the time to engage in a very difficult and complex conversation. It's a really, it's been an honor and a privilege to just connect and to be here. Thank you so much for the participants who've chosen the session to engage in, and I hope that it was a fruitful and really inspiring conversation. And this is an open invitation to journey with us in our quest for really like understanding what are tools and strategies and practices for thinking about reimagining health systems for social justice. And yeah, I will leave it there. But thank you so much. Just all around thank yous. And then find us on the website, African Health Features. Our Twitter handles is @AfriDecarHealth. Our Instagram also @AfriDecarHealth, as well as Facebook. Our hashtags Reimagine Health, Tools for Reimagining, Paradigm to Praxis. Thank you.